Olá, bom dia a todas e todos. Sejam bem-vindos aqui à FAPESP. Nós vamos dar início à 8ª Conferência FAPESP do ano de 2024, com o tema Repensando a Pós-Memória, depois de 7 de outubro, palestra que será proferida pela professora Marianne Hirsch, da Universidade de Columbia. E para compor a mesa de abertura, nós convidamos o diretor administrativo da FAPESP, professor Fernando Menezes. Nossa conferencista, a professora Marianne Hirsch. O coordenador da comissão organizadora das conferências FAPESP e escolas FAPESP de ciência interdisciplinar, professor Fernando Ferreira Costa, da Unicamp. Professor Esther Hamburger, da USP, que também é a coordenadora desta conferência. E o nosso convidado, debatedor, professor Márcio Seliman Silva, da Unicamp. Passamos então a palavra ao professor Fernando Menezes, diretor administrativo aqui da FAPESP.
Bom dia. Eu falarei de modo muito breve, mas tão breve quanto intenso eu quero ser no agradecimento à professora Marianne Hirsch por ter recebido e aceito esse nosso convite, que muito nos honra, para sua conferência no nosso ciclo de conferências FAPESP. Eu agradeço, em nome da FAPESP, mais uma vez, os queridos professores Fernando Costa, Esther Hamburger, Márcio Seligman, que já foram apresentados nessa manhã, professor Bafa, professor Jolie, todas as senhoras, todos os senhores aqui presentes. A FAPESP, como sabem, tem múltiplas iniciativas para além do seu papel central, que é o do fomento à pesquisa por meio de financiamento de projetos. Mas, ainda que nós não sejamos uma instituição destinada diretamente à realização da pesquisa, entendemos que existem iniciativas que são perfeitamente compatíveis com essa nossa missão institucional e faz parte desse espírito de união, esse espírito de comunidade com todas as instituições de pesquisa do Estado, com todos aqueles que realizam pesquisa no Estado de São Paulo, sediarmos eventos dessa natureza e contribuirmos com a divulgação do conhecimento por meio não apenas da organização, mas também de todo o nosso sistema de comunicação de ciência, né? Sabemos todos que temos uma agência de notícias bastante eficiente, uma revista de divulgação científica. Tudo isso cria um contexto que faz da FAPESP, além do fomentador de pesquisa por meios financeiros, também um grande fomentador da pesquisa, do avanço do conhecimento, por meio da difusão, da realização e da difusão de eventos científicos. Eu não falarei mais diretamente da riquíssima biografia de nossa convidada, porque isso será feito pelos meus colegas organizadores da sessão desta manhã. Mas eu reitero, em nome do professor Marco Antônio Zago, em nome dos meus colegas de diretoria da FAPESP, a grande alegria, a grande honra de tê-la entre nós, professora Marianne Hirsch, e agradeço igualmente a adesão de todos que nos acompanham aqui presencialmente e que nos acompanham pela transmissão online do vídeo que será feito dessa apresentação. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado, professor Fernando. A seguir, então, ouviremos a professora Esther Hamburger, membro da comissão organizadora das conferências FAPESP.
É um enorme prazer estar aqui, finalmente, apresentando essa conferência da professora Marianne Hirsch, que a gente começou a planejar há mais de um ano, uma das primeiras conferências que a gente começou a organizar. Organizar essas conferências envolve contatos, envolve bater agendas, e é um processo lento, né? Mas é um processo muito prazeroso, porque ele vem propiciando que as pessoas venham à FAPESP, né? Pessoas da vida acadêmica e pessoas próximas à vida acadêmica, e é uma atividade que procura estimular a discussão transdisciplinar, e a gente vem vendo se formar um público, e a gente espera que vocês que estão aqui hoje contribuam para divulgar esse espaço que acontece a cada final de mês, toda a última sexta-feira do mês, às 10 da manhã, em torno dos mais diversos temas que se situam na fronteira do conhecimento, que se situam, enfim, tocam nos desafios que estão colocados para a vida no planeta, nesse momento que não é um momento fácil da nossa existência, né? No trabalho, quando a gente primeiro pensou na vinda da Marianne, ela desenvolvia o Zip Code Project, que mapeava vítimas da Covid nos bairros em volta da Universidade de Columbia, numa parceria acadêmica com organizações e pessoas que moravam nas imediações, e que tinha a ver com a memória da pandemia, né? Hoje, a gente está diante de outros desafios de lá para cá, mas o pensamento dela sobre a pós-memória, que é um pensamento vivo, né, ele reage e propõe diante das situações mais duras que a gente enfrenta. A professora Marianne William Petterfield Trent, professor emérita de Inglês e Literatura Comparada na Universidade de Columbia. No trabalho dela, a pós-memória se desdobra em contextos sociais, tempo e lugar diversos, atravessada também pelas relações de gênero. Sua reflexão na intersecção do feminismo com os estudos da memória se debruça sobre o trabalho de escritores e artistas visuais que encaram a herança de violências sociais não experimentadas. Maus, cartoon de Art Spiegelman, ao qual ela retorna hoje, e em reinterpretações sucessivas, é apenas um dos autores que ela aborda. Nascida na Romênia, imigrou com os pais que sobreviveram ao nazismo para os Estados Unidos no início dos anos 60. Seu pensamento parte de suas próprias experiências mediadas com o nazismo para pensar de maneira comparada violências que se propagam de maneira mediada por gerações em outros contextos culturais, religiosos e raciais. Essa abertura para outras formas de discriminação permite a abordagem original e visceral com que enfrenta os desafios postos pelo horror que se reproduz novamente agora contra os palestinos. Em que medida a ênfase dos estudos da memória no trauma favoreceu interpretações que favorecem a vitimização, que, por sua vez, justifica aberrações? Professora no Instituto de Investigação sobre Mulheres, Gênero e Sexualidade, ela é membro da Academia Americana de Artes e Ciências e foi presidente da Modern Language Association of America. Estudou na Universidade de Brown. Os seus livros mais recentes são Imagining Everyday Life, Encounters with Vernacular Photography, vencedor do catálogo de fotografia da Fundação Paris Photo Aperture, de 2020. School Pictures in Liquid Time, Reframing Difference, coescrito com Leo Spitzer, que também está aqui presente, nos honra com a sua presença, e falará na segunda-feira, para quem tiver interesse, sobre racismo e antissemitismo, no auditório da Biblioteca Mindlin, às 14 horas, com a presença da professora Lili Schwartz, que também está aqui nos honrando com a sua presença. Continuando a lista de livros, Women Mobilizing Memory, coeditado com Eze Gu Altinei, Maria José Contreras, Jean Howard, Banu Caraca e Alicia Solomon, na Columbia University Press, e outros livros incluem The Generation of Post-Memory, Writing and Visual Culture After the Holocaust, Columbia University Press, Ghosts of Home, The Afterlife of Chernovitz in Jewish Memory, em coautoria com Leo Spitzer, Rights of Return, Diaspora Poetics and the Politics of Memory, coeditado com Nancy Miller, e com Diana Taylor, que é de Performance Studies, coeditou a edição de verão de 2012 da Hemisférica sobre The Subject of Archives. Enfim, ela tem outras publicações, eu não vou me alongar assim. Foi editora da PMLA, recebeu bolsas da Fundação Guggenheim, da American Council of Learned Societies, do Mary Ingraham Bunting Institute, do National Humanities Centers e das fundações Bellagio e Bogliasco. Fez parte do Conselho Executivo da MLA, do Conselho Consultivo da ACLA, do Conselho de Supervisores da English Institute e do Conselho Executivo da Society for the Study of Narrative Literature. Faz parte dos conselhos consultivos da Memory Studies e da Contemporary Women's Writing. É uma das fundadoras do Centro para o Estudo da Diferença Social da Universidade de Columbia e da sua iniciativa global Women Creating Change. Eu me identifico muito com o trabalho da Marianne, por razões também familiares, filha de... Meu pai nasceu em 1933 em Berlim, numa família judia, veio para o Brasil aos 3 anos, cresceu aqui, tinha muito orgulho do Brasil, se considerava brasileiro, e se casou com a minha mãe, que era de origem católica. Eu sou filha de uma mistura e da utopia da convivência e da tolerância. Então, é em nome da convivência, da tolerância e da paz que eu passo a palavra à professora Marianne.
We have 15 minutes. Do you want me to advise you? We have 10 minutes to the end. Sure. Okay. I'll look at the second, but I can put it over there. Good morning. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you for this invitation, for this wonderful set of introductions. Thank you, Fernando, for introducing me to FAPESP, which sounds like such a wonderful organization. I'm ready to apply for my next research projects. Thank you especially to Esther and Marcio for moderating this session, and to everyone, Vera especially, who organized all this, and thank you to the translators. I hope I will not speak too quickly and be able to have the translations into Portuguese. I don't see so many headphones, but there are certainly a few. I'm especially grateful today for this invitation and for your willingness to participate in what has become an exceedingly difficult and divisive conversation in the US and especially in US academia right now. A conversation about what has happened in the aftermath of October 7th, 2023 in the Middle East. As you might have heard, my own university, Columbia, has been at the epicenter of some of the existential conflicts that have arisen around questions of guilt and responsibility for the persisting violence in the Middle East, with growing accusations that it is anti-Semitism and not a critique of a nation-state waging war that has motivated some of the critique and protest. As a child of Holocaust survivors, as you've just heard, and as a scholar of memory and its transgenerational transmission, a process that I have discussed as post-memory, I'm not surprised by the prominence that the specter of the Holocaust has assumed at this moment. At the same time, I'm deeply disturbed by to see how the Holocaust and my own family's persecution and suffering during the Second World War is being used by apologists of the Israeli state as an alibi for the brutal violence against the people of Gaza, now over 40,000 of whom have been killed, among them tens of thousands of civilians and notably children. The radical discord about the meanings and long-standing effects of the Holocaust in this context, and really the virulence of the debates surrounding them, have given me serious pause. The concern about the ideological misuse of Holocaust memory is not in any way a new phenomenon. Prominent Jewish survivors and intellectuals like Jean Améry, Zygmunt Bauman, and of course Hannah Arendt condemned the use of the memory of the Holocaust for Israel's political purposes as early as the 1950s. The misappropriation that they warned against has only been amplified after last October 7th. Israeli politicians and the media have repeatedly and increasingly equated Hamas with Nazis on the one hand and called Palestinians human animals on the other, thus recalling Nazi rhetoric against Jews. Absurdly, some have called Jews who support Palestinian liberation capos. Along with colleagues from the field of Holocaust studies, I've contested this current weaponization of the Holocaust and of anti-Semitism in the interest of retaliatory eliminationist violence under the guise of security and self-defense. There have been many petitions, many letters circulating. We had this petition, there was a counter public letter, we countered the counter public letter. It's a very, very lively and in many ways acrimonious exchange. But what those of us in the field have not yet done, and what I'm trying to do in this talk, is to consider how the approaches to the memory of the Holocaust that predominated in scholarship and pedagogy for several decades have left a space for this ideological and political misuse. So I'm talking specifically about approaches in the United States and in Europe, also in some ways in Israel. I don't really know about how the Holocaust is being taught in South America, so I would love to find out more, especially about Brazil. I don't think that those of us who've been in this field have yet considered how our own methodologies might have fueled the kind of existential fear of a renewed Holocaust that we're currently witnessing. And this is what I'd like to focus on with you this morning as a kind of intervention, what the implications are of conflating October 7th with the Shoah, and how Holocaust studies might have contributed to this conflation. I'm thinking in particular of the pervasive influence of trauma that for a long time dominated the discussion of Holocaust victimization, and that might have encouraged a potentially exceptionalist understanding of it. And I'm thinking also of the powerful ways in which trauma can be transmitted across multiple generations, and how that has enabled many to claim that to inherit the legacy of the Holocaust in the second, third, and subsequent generations is to suffer transgenerational trauma. So you've had two people on the podium here who are part of this generation, Esther and myself, and we can discuss this from a personal perspective, but also, of course, from a scholarly one. And of course, talking about trauma here is especially resonant because we've all been I've been part of, just a little bit part of a project that you've all had here on cultural trauma and on trauma and the crises in democracy. So in a way, this is also responding to some local concerns. So since the 1970s, individual acts of survivor witness have been collected in video testimony archives that have widely influenced Holocaust pedagogy at both high school and college levels. The extreme psychic injury that's movingly expressed in some of these accounts has also inflected aesthetic choices of Holocaust art, including film, literature, visual arts, music, museology, and memorialization. These aesthetic forms have invited specifically empathy and identification with the victims. Could it be, I want to ask, that this trauma-driven memory culture that the field of Holocaust studies enabled might at least be partially responsible for what we're seeing since last October? Hyperbolically publicized fears of rampant anti-Semitism and thus of a returning Holocaust. Decidedly, that is not what I have meant my own work on post-memory to be understood, not how I've meant that to be understood. As a result, I find myself in the position of wanting to rethink a number of earlier assumptions in my work, and I do so from a very different moment in the study and practice of cultural memory and memorialization. Indeed, the field of memory studies has shifted. It's come to acknowledge the deep traumatic injuries left by numerous painful histories in different parts of the world, diverse history of enslavement, of colonialism, of racism, dictatorship, war, and genocide. To be sure, Holocaust victimization remains an ever-present subject. And here's an example of the kind of comparative work that we see in Buenos Aires, where the sites of memory in Buenos Aires recall in a mirror image the sites of the camps in Nazi Germany. So this kind of comparative work has already been done for the last 20 years or so. But now, within the field of memory studies, the centrality of the Holocaust as a universal signifier and as a limit case has in large part given way to comparative, multidirectional, and connective methodologies that relate but do not conflate distinct historical catastrophes, and that want to grant each one its own historical specificity and evolution, but some of the tactics of memory and protest are in many ways resonant across the globe. Here's, for example, the mothers' movements of the disappeared in several parts of the world, starting, I think, with the Madres in Buenos Aires. So this is not in any way strict comparison, but it's a way of relating memory. And the question when you entertain relational memory practices is who is relating, for whom, for what purpose? Of course, the Israelis are now relating Hamas with Nazism, so we have to ask what are the stakes of creating these kinds of relationships. I think they're very different here from that kind of comparison. But, and we have to also ask what can we learn from these kinds of comparative relational, connective approaches. These broader perspectives and comparative methodologies have also come to modulate the scope of traumatic repetition and return. They've left openings for accounts of individual and collective healing, activist resistance, as you see here, and the possibilities of cultural repair. So let me go back to an earlier moment, the growth of the trauma paradigm, and try to put that into a little bit of a intellectual historical perspective. The testimony of witnesses has been central to how the Holocaust is remembered, as French historian Annette Viviorca showed in her 1998 book, L'ère du témoin, The Era of the Witness. Immediately after the war, numerous hidden and buried testimonials by victims were recovered, and many survivors were interviewed. However, Viviorca argues that the advent of the witness did not occur on a global scale until the Jerusalem trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961. This first televised trial was meant to serve broad pedagogical purposes, exposing viewers, and also radio was an important medium for receiving the testimonies in the trial. But it was meant to expose viewers around the globe to the ultimate evil of a Nazi perpetrator sitting in a glass box. At the same time, however, it was also meant to feature the embodied survivor witnesses who, in Viviorca's terms, become bearers of history. At the heart of this new identity, she writes, of the survivor was a new function, to be the bearer of history, to carry history, the embodiment of memory, attesting to the past and to the continuing presence of the past. They were meant to narrate and act out their devastating experiences on the stand and to show the continued presence of the past. Tellingly, Hannah Arendt, who reported on the trial for The New Yorker and later published her dispatches in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem, was critical of how the Jewish state instrumentalized victim suffering into a tool of nation building. So this was 1961, but it was not until the 1980s and 1990s that the voice of the witness from inside the event, in the term of psychoanalyst Dori Laub, became the primary source for attempting to understand the Nazi genocide. But it also became the way to understand the workings of trauma more generally, its injury to the psyche and soul, its seeming incurability and inevitable repetition, its transmissibility across bodies and generations. So Laub writes, let me now read the quote also for the translation, because trauma returns in disjointed fragments in the memory of the survivor, the listener has to let these trauma fragments make their impact both on him and on the witness. Testimony is the narratives addressed to hearing. In the center of this massive, dedicated effort remains a danger, a nightmare, a fragility, a woundedness that defies all healing. And here the listener becomes traumatized, becomes also himself or herself a victim by being touched so deeply by the transmission of the traumatic past through, not only through the words, but also through in the body of the survivor. So this, in the early 1980s and 90s, coincided with the US Medical Diagnostic Manual's DSM-3 first entry on post-traumatic stress disorder. This was in 1980, was the first time that, and of course it was in relation also to the Vietnam War, and this is a very interesting difference here because in Vietnam, as my colleague Nadia Abu Al-Haj just wrote in her own book on combat trauma, in the US, the traumatized of the Vietnam War were the American soldiers. So here, perpetrators become the victims of trauma, and that is another way that trauma can be manipulated for different kinds of ideological and political purposes. So there's a much larger discussion about trauma that's beginning around this particular question right now. How do we use it and for what purpose? So this was an aside. So, but this entry sparked a growing multidisciplinary scholarship on the effects of trauma on remembrance and transmission. Some key works on trauma as a multi-pronged field of knowledge production by Judith Lewis Herman, for example, in 1992, and Kathy Caruth in 1995, were daringly comparative. They showed similar effects in the experiences of child sexual abuse, wartime suffering for soldiers and civilians, nuclear destruction, and more. Trauma has proven to be a generative concept in my own work on the archives of violence that emerged from the Holocaust and other catastrophic histories. And I'm not alone. It's been pervasive. It has offered lenses through which to recognize forgotten or disposable lives and stories, and also to acknowledge injury and injustice in their continuing afterlives for subsequent generations. Trauma has generated new conceptions of time, understandings of trauma, new conceptions of time, in that it always occurs in the present in the form of a perpetual return, and it has generated new epistemologies in the ideas of unknowability and unspeakability. So here Charlotte Delbo, a survivor of Auschwitz, writes, Auschwitz is there, unalterable, precise, but enveloped in the skin of memory, an impermeable skin that isolates it from my present self. I live within a twofold being. So this idea of the traumatized self as a bifurcated self is, Delbo explained so powerfully. But some of these ideas have also been contested. The debates surrounding these fundamental contributions have enriched our understanding of the aftermath of personal and historical catastrophes. Debated as well has been the widespread conception of trauma as a singular, if multifaceted event, an accident, a war, or a genocide. What we've brought to trauma studies is histories of enslavement that are not necessarily over because of continued racism. So here, just an example from Toni Morrison's incredible novel, Beloved. She writes, some things you forget, other things you never do. If a house burns down, it's gone, but the place, the picture of it stays, and not just in my memory, but out there in the world. If you go there, you who never was there, if you go there and stand in the place where it was, it will happen again. It will be there for you, waiting for you. So this demonstration of traumatic repetition, but especially powerful in the sense of when the aftermath or the effects of the events are not resolved or not healed or not addressed. And also, we're now discussing the slow violence, to use Rob Nixon's terms, that humans are perpetrating on the planet, and thus also on vulnerable species and populations. So trauma studies have evolved beyond a concentration on the singular event and beyond their foundational European psychoanalytic origins. Still, the Holocaust became, and in many ways has remained, fundamental to the study of trauma. And at the same time, trauma became essential to studying the Holocaust. How could that not be? After all, Jeffrey Hartman, one of the founders in 1979 of the Fortunoff Archive for Holocaust Testimony, explained that witness testimony has the potential to, he writes, burn through the cold storage of history. The words of witnesses, he wrote, are like raw poetry. Watching and teaching footage from the Eichmann trial and subsequent video testimonies collected in archives, we could not only study the events of the past, but also observe how their memory lives on in the individual body and is communicated and transmitted to listeners and descended. It was in the spirit of embodied remembrance and traumatized speech that Claude Lanzmann's 1986 film Shoah, 9.5 hours, became a staple of Holocaust remembrance and pedagogy. Consisting of 9.5 hours of witness testimonies, Lanzmann's film enabled viewers and students to hear and to see on screen fractured testimonial accounts emerging from within the remembering body and voice. In a few uncanny scenes, survivor and bystander witnesses no longer merely narrate the past, but literally seem to be back inside it. In these moments of and become unable to speak. So in these moments of muteness, the witnesses' mouths literally dry up and can no longer utter words and sentences. Here, memory gives way to what Lanzmann calls incarnation, illustrating the paralyzing effects of the past seemingly inevitable traumatic return in response to present triggers. It is these moments also that the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben highlights in his influential 1999 book, Remnants of Auschwitz, The Witness in the Archive. paradoxically asserting in his reading of Primo Levi that the one who cannot bear witness is the true witness, enacting humanity at its limits. These are quotes from Agamben. So testimony archives illustrate how memory and affect supplement historical documents and produce a more encompassing understanding of the past, not just what happened, but also how it has been transmitted to us. But some trauma and Holocaust scholars have cautioned over the years that featuring muteness as communicating more than speech comes with considerable dangers of mystifying the Holocaust. And this is part of a longer critique of trauma studies in the academy. As early as the 1990s, for example, Patricia Yeager wrote about how we consume trauma and traffic in the studies of the dead in our courses, that this over-interest in the muteness of the witness, in the enormity and unspeakability, especially for the Holocaust, to see it only as its most extreme event, the death camp and the gas chamber, risks privileging utter victimization, even while concealing other views. For example, moments of resilience, of courage and ingenuity that enable survival. Instead, the extreme and powerful affect we find in the unlikely survivors of death camps featured in films like Shoah lends itself to uniqueness and exceptionalism that draw readers, viewers, and students into a traumatic past which can overwhelm the present. Many post-Holocaust works invite us to identify and to allow ourselves to be traumatized. But this invitation risks contributing to and authorizing the ongoing sacralization of the Holocaust that the Holocaust has acquired in cultural memory. It risks obscuring the voices of those survivor witnesses who do tell their story as best they can in the interest of passing it on to the future. And it risks precluding the possibility of therapeutic listening in the interest of healing and repair. Recently, now, of course, we're at a moment when very few Holocaust survivors are alive. Many of them were very young child survivors. So recently, in the USC Shoah Foundation and now also the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York, these institutions have put enormous resources into creating hologram witnesses with the help of AI. They chose very articulate witnesses who will continue to speak through these technologies beyond their death, in responding to specific questions of visitors, which AI will match with some of the testimonies that these people have given. This project, of course, reveals, and you don't have to read her whole biography, but this is Eva Kor, who's one of the witnesses at the U.S. Shoah Foundation, who appears on this huge screen and speaks to us in relation to questions. One example. This project reveals the anxiety about losing these voices and the direct connection to the generation of survivors in the event. But at the same time, it also dispels the notion of unspeakability, since these witnesses do speak and they interact with us. Of course, they speak through AI, but they spoke for many, many hours with the interviewer. So I think we're at a somewhat new moment. And they're asked very everyday questions. You know, what was your favorite song when you were a child? Things like this. So they are also desacralized. At the same time, however, I believe that after October 7th, it's especially important to recognize the dangers of building Holocaust memory on victimization alone, which has returned since this moment, and also of identifying Jewishness so directly with the Holocaust. Because if we only remember the Holocaust and by extension Jewishness through extreme trauma, then in turn we allow the Holocaust to serve as the privileged site for the study of traumatic injury. In addition, when Israel is presented as a site of redemption for Jewish suffering during the Holocaust, as it has in many narratives, then that very suffering becomes an alibi that authorizes violence and destruction in the service of defense. So this is not, I would argue, what we owe the victims. And I'm bringing you just a short quote from this very important book by the legal theorist Martha Minow, who tells us what what we do owe survivors, what they do need. Survivors of mass violence, she writes, need to tell their story and be heard without interruption and skepticism. They need a commitment to produce a coherent, if complex, narrative about the entire nation's or group's trauma and the multiple sources and expressions of its violence. So this is a very different kind of listening that's also a kind of political listening that she asks for. So in recent years, following scholars like Minnow, many memory scholars, artists, and practitioners have been trying to contest the inevitability of traumatic return that leaves those affected by violence, along with their descendants, forever as victims, forever vulnerable to repetition, whether psychic or material. We are seeing a turn toward practices of active listening, of communal healing and repair that have occasioned activist interventions in the interest of preventing further violence and envisioning a more interconnected future. Importantly, these methodologies have made it possible, for example, to think about connections between the memories and post-memories of the Holocaust and the Nakba, essential to what Edward Said called bases for coexistence. The Nakba, of course, the expulsion of Palestinians from Palestinian lands in 1948 and after. But in the crises after October 7th, the trauma paradigm has regained momentum, both through its own historical and effective persistence and through political and media-driven manipulation and exploitation. The lens of compounded trauma has magnified a vision of uniqueness that, in historian Omar Bartov's terms, removes the Holocaust from history. And it feeds the reactivation and contagion of unruly affects like fear, terror, guilt, and rage, revealing the reactionary potentials of transgenerational memory. What then is the responsibility of those of us who might have contributed, however inadvertently, to the tenacity of this trauma-driven version of Holocaust memory? So let me now turn just briefly to post-memory and the history of this concept. And you see me here holding in the palm of my hand a very small book that was made by prisoners in a concentration camp in Romania for the doctor who helped them identify and treated them for a horrible disease that was in that camp. And I'm doing this to show you what it means to hold the past, right? What kind of care we owe the victims and those who produced this leather-bound mini book to honor this doctor. So in saying we and our here today, I acknowledge that the evolution of the trauma paradigm defining Holocaust remembrance, as well as the shifting pedagogical, scholarly, and aesthetic choices that have emerged to reflect it in literature, art, memorials, museums, and syllabi and courses, are largely the work of my generation, that of descendants of survivors. Eva Hoffman, the writer, Eva Hoffman is a wonderful spokesperson for our generation. She wrote in her book, After Such Knowledge, the guardianship of the Holocaust is being passed on to us. The second generation is the hinge generation, in which received, transferred knowledge of events is being transmuted to history or into myth. But it's also the generation in which we can think about certain questions arising from the Shoah with a sense of living connection, which now is being mirrored by AI so that that sense of living connection can continue. Many of us, scholars, teachers, and artists, came to the work of trauma and memory with our feminist, anti-racist, anti-colonial, and anti-military commitments. The turn to the past for us was part of an intellectual and political project dedicated to critiquing and enlarging the present, to contesting official histories, to making space for suppressed or forgotten voices that might enlarge the historical archive. But for some of us, the turn was also personal. As Hoffman writes, the memories, not memories, but emanations of wartime experiences kept erupting in flashes of imagery, in abrupt but broken refrains. In my own case, there were times when my parents' memories of surviving the war in collaborationist Romania felt more real than my own childhood memories. They felt more real even though, as for other familial descendants, they were transmitted incompletely and indirectly, leaving space for imaginative investment, projection, creation, and for many, many questions and unsolved mysteries. For us, these were not memories, but what I've described as post-memories, powerful and vivid, yet belated and mediated, temporally and qualitatively removed. And yet, recently, the science of epigenetics has confirmed the experience of intergenerational trauma that many people in mine and in subsequent generations have described. Epigenetics, of course, is the study of the field of genetics of cellular or trait variations caused by environmental factors that mark not the DNA sequence itself, but gene expression, the lining of the cells, epi meaning on, over, around, near, and after. These genetic tags, occasioned by environmental factors, it's now believed, are not erased between generations, but can be inherited and transmitted along with DNA sequences themselves, adding to the genetic, behavioral, and symbolic systems, you see here all of them in this book, through which the past is transmitted over time. In one widely reported study at Mount Sinai Medical Center in New York, researcher Rachel Yehuda established correlations between parental trauma suffered, between parental trauma suffered pre-conception and the epigenetic makeup of trauma survivors' children. Significantly, Yehuda based her study on 38 children of Holocaust survivors, a very small sample. The study controlled for traumatic experiences that the children themselves might have had, and was able to control also against demographically comparable subjects. And Yehuda found that epigenetic tags of the children of Holocaust survivors exhibited stress hormone profiles that showed greater predisposition to PTSD, the post-traumatic stress disorder, and other stress disorders than those of peers in their control group. So it confirms these experiences that we've observed in literature and artwork by the post generations. But I think that this increasing interest in epigenetics and the widespread press that Yehuda's study has received is a symptom of a larger trend, the tendency to biologize the legacies of traumatic histories, firmly locating traumatic transmission within a very narrow circle, the circle of the family. While Yehuda's study attempts to control for contemporary traumatic experiences that might have introduced epigenetic tags in her subjects directly, she can't control for other generational, cultural, environmental factors that mark and influence us in more indirect ways. So it's impossible really to do that. In my own work on post-memory, I've argued that the intergenerational transmission of trauma transcends the bounds of the individual and the family, relying on complex and multiple textual, affective, and embodied scenes of transmission. So I'm bringing you here, I hope that people here know Art Spiegelman's mouse, and I'm bringing you here the first mouse that he drew as early as 1972 on the left of the screen, where he draws the photograph by Margaret Borg-White of survivors of Buchenwald. And Spiegelman puts a little arrow, I hope you can see it at the top, where he says Papa to one of those prisoners. His father was not in Buchenwald, he's not in that photograph, he was in Auschwitz. But what I'm trying to show here is that cultural texts like this photograph influence how we see our own familial memories. So these are not separate and therefore not only biologically or genetically or epigenetically inherited. The transmission of trauma I want to show transcends the individual and the family, and it is mediated by other texts. But also that it can be widely adopted and further disseminated. For generational transcendence, especially for those of us who are familial descendants of Holocaust survivors, the weighty inheritance of such extreme trauma comes with an important caveat: the consciousness that no matter how immediate it feels, no matter how much we identify and empathize, our post-memory is vicarious. And we see here one panel from Maus, and you don't have to read it all, but it just shows his own insecurity in trying to get the story right, and of course done with a lot of humor, and it runs through the book, and it runs through all of Spiegelman's writing, that he only relies on very attenuated archives, very distant accounts of the experience. There's no direct transmission. We are not, as many erroneously insist, second-generation survivors. This has become a term, third-generation survivor, and so on. We are descendants of survivors. It can be easy to forget that, although it could have been me, which it sometimes feels like, it was not me. It was their story. It was not my story. Our post-memories do not grant us the status as victims. But I'm wondering now, have we insisted on this distinction forcefully enough? The unmediated reenactment of inherited trauma, whether familial or collective, that manifests itself in the fears of annihilation expressed by many Jews in the aftermath of October 7th, would suggest not. Memorial artists, writers, and museologists have developed a compelling post-memorial aesthetic which reflects the complex, contradictory, multiply mediated elements of the structure of transmission. And I'm bringing you here just one work by the Argentinian artist and daughter of Auschwitz survivors, Mirta Kupfermeng, all of them with me, which starts with one family photograph on the bottom, which is a family tree, and then evolves with her own schoolgirl persona carrying this weight of the past, and then the past that then emerges even from the wall, with a stain in the wall and the books that she has amassed. You can't really here get away with it. But she also shows how mediated it is. So these artists like Kupfermeng and Spiegelman evoke the haunting that ensues in the aftermath of trauma and the pull to relive it. But the gaps in knowledge and understanding, the silences and fractures that characterize this aesthetic knowledge, the unbridgeable distance of such extreme experiences, even as they provoke an urge to learn more and understand, is all in this work. These works engage readers and viewers in acts of mourning for a lost world, but not just in identification, also in impulses to repair the loss and heal those who have suffered it. But they always mark blockages and frustrations. So Maus, as I've just said, is a great example of a text that modulates familial proximity on the one hand to the victims, with unbridgeable distance, identification, also with distance and disavowal. Spiegelman cautions against easy identification with this history of victimhood, and he demonstrates its dire risks. So when his character wears a concentration camp uniform in identification with his parents, he has a mental breakdown. When he draws himself as a mouse on the little mouse on a chair, he's back inside. He's a terrified child. His own generational distance is signaled by the mouse mask that can be removed, but sometimes the smoke from the crematorium chimneys come into his drawing studio, merging with the smoke from his cigarette. This is the conflation that is always risks happening, but not necessarily, doesn't have to. And this conflating of the present with the past is something that Edward Said warned against decades ago, when he wrote in The Question of Palestine, "There can be no way of satisfactorily conducting a life whose main concern is to prevent the past from recurring. For Zionism, the Palestinians have now become the equivalent of a past experience reincarnated in the form of a present threat. The result is that the Palestinians' future as a people is mortgaged to that fear, which is a disaster for them and for the Jews." It's such a prescient, I mean, it was relevant when he wrote it in 1972, it's relevant today. After October 7th, we're seeing how at moments of crisis and danger, the phantom of the Holocaust can resurface to reactivate transgenerational trauma in Jewish communities for those who were there and for those like me, for example, who were not there. Contagious among persecuted groups, inherited trauma and the resulting dread can easily be amplified and exploited. And I don't want to say that it's not there, that it's not real, but it can be easily exploited. But as real as it might feel, we do need to ask whether these fears emerge from actual memories or post-memories of the Holocaust or of Nazism, or whether they are vicarious Holocaust effects that act like memories, to use a term coined also in the 1990s by the scholar Ernst van Alphen to describe post-Holocaust art. As symptoms, they reactivate a past catastrophe in groups that are still haunted by it. I do not in any way deny the existence and growth of global anti-Semitism, nor the phenomenon of lasting indirect of compounded transgenerational trauma. But I believe that we must be aware of how the contagion driving these phenomena today can lead to a perpetuation of a culture of defensiveness and denial, of racialized hatred, nationalism, and ethnocentrism that can only lead to further violence. We must be aware of how the inherited trauma we have ourselves studied and theorized, speaking here to colleagues, right, can make it difficult to perceive and acknowledge the larger context and suffering of those deemed other. Most immediately, as the trauma paradigm persists for Jews, it is Palestinians whose inherited trauma of expulsion and dispossession is made invisible and whose lives are deemed less precious and, in Judith Butler's terms, less grievable. And I think this is a very useful way to think about grievability. In recent years, however, it's precisely these larger contexts and the responsibilities that they have spawned that have come to shape memory studies and its commitment to social justice. Comparative, multidirectional, and connective approaches, as I've already mentioned, to memories of painful past have certainly brought the insights and theories of trauma and witnessing drawn from Holocaust testimony to other historical catastrophes. But they've also enjoined us to revisit the trauma suffered by Holocaust survivors and to find alternative stories and representations contained in these accounts. Importantly, the moments of resistance and resilience, as well as possibility, potentiality, even hope, that have emerged in the stories of survivors of enslavement, of dictatorship, of gender-based and racialized persecution, these stories have helped Holocaust scholars and artists reimagine the exclusive focus on trauma and its inexorable after effects. So to come back just very briefly to Maus, the mother, Artie's mother, is always represented in Maus as a helpless victim who eventually commits suicide. But if we reread some of the scenes, we see that, for example, in this scene, she was in the resistance. She was carrying packages. She was putting her own life at risk. She was very ingenious. And that in Auschwitz, she negotiated with the couple in her cell, sent that woman to her husband in the men's camp, who repaired her shoes, and then Anja was treated better in her own camp. So she was very similar in some ways to her husband, even though she's represented through utter victimization. So these are important moments to reread. So individual and collective accounts can be reread and reimagined, and in so doing, Holocaust memory can participate in the practices and discourses of accountability, justice, mutual aid, and repair, practices that aim to resist the unforgiving return of trauma and to create different memories to pass down through generations. Such a relational memory of the Holocaust was beginning to take shape, only to be halted in response to October 7th. So why continue to teach the Holocaust? Why continue to build and visit Holocaust memorials and museums, a new one just opened in Amsterdam. What lessons do they offer our present and future now, after the attacks of October 7th, and in the midst of genocidal devastation in Gaza? For survivors and generations born after, it's been in large part to practice an ethos of never again, not just for Jews, but for everyone. Although this universalizing vision of Holocaust memory has certainly eroded over the last decades, we now see never again serving as a uniquely ethno-nationalist Israeli reaction formation to October 7th that fuels defensiveness and disavowal, paranoia, and renewed cycles of violence. It's only when never again for anyone becomes a rallying cry for justice and possibility that we can assume responsibility to, in Judith Butler's terms, preserve the life of the other. A relational understanding of memory based on a shared, if differential, embodied vulnerability elicits different demands across subjects of generation. Not so much the identification and empathy we have learned from Holocaust trauma, for some repeated on October 7th, 2023, but in a more activist vein, forms of co-witnessing, solidarity, and co-resistance that also grant distance and difference. A different relational pedagogy might enable us more openly to acknowledge our mutual vulnerability rather than demanding permanent security for ourselves at the expense of the other. That pedagogy would have to acknowledge the legacy of the Nakba and the costs of Jewish settlement in Palestinian lands in the aftermath of the Holocaust. At this moment, I cannot imagine a course or a conference or an exhibition on the Holocaust that would not include reflections on a Palestinian narrative following from the Nakba, and this is a controversial position. One of the most far-reaching legacies of the Holocaust has been the post-war regime of transitional justice that has emerged. There were trials, of course, but importantly, the Shoah gave rise to what the writer Pankaj Mishra recently described as an edifice of global norms built after 1945. In the absence of anything more effective, he writes, the Shoah remains indispensable as a standard for gauging the political and moral health of societies. He believes that the Shoah's moral significance could be rescued if the present calamity is acknowledged. But haven't Palestinians always already been left out of the evaluation of political and moral health of societies? If we think about how the present war is being waged in a narrow interest of never again for an ethno-nationalist Israeli state alone, rather than a never again for anyone, we might wonder whether the Holocaust could ever serve as a universal signifier again, if it ever did. So these numerous links that we're seeing between the Holocaust and the attacks of October 7th conflate the extremity of one with the extremity of the other. News and press reports, video compilations, horrific images that we've seen of October 7th echo the fear of Holocaust denial. We have to prove that it happened and that it was horrific. Of course, it was horrific. But that proof, these links, are problematic. And for example, in the Visual History Archive of the Shoah Foundation, very early, already in October, appeared a project to interview survivors of October 7th along with survivors of the Holocaust. That is the conflation. The characterization of the Holocaust as the crime of all crimes, one that is always in danger of being displaced or denied, impedes rather than clarifying an understanding of other genocide and of the genocidal character of the war in Gaza. And the way it is being misused as a warning of rampant global anti-Semitism occludes other Jewish history, some unconnected to the Shoah. So I'm coming to a close in 2 minutes. We're discussing all of this amid immeasurable trauma suffered by Gazans faced with destruction of their life and life worlds, and enduring death and starvation by Palestinians in the increasingly violent West Bank, now also by Lebanese civilians. It's hard to imagine how this complex, compounded trauma can be addressed and worked through, how it will be transmitted to future generations. The characterization of the Holocaust as the crime of all crimes, one that's always in danger of being displaced or denied, impedes rather than clarifying an understanding of other genocides and of the genocidal character of the war in Gaza. The psychoanalyst and trauma expert Bessel van der Kolk suggests that to heal from trauma requires the support of a safe and supportive container. What kind of support might enable Palestinians to confront this devastation and to envision a sustainable future? What structures of accountability and justice could make possible a communal coming to terms with these crimes? And also, how will the violence of October 7th, the plight of Israeli hostages, Israel's responsibility for genocide in Gaza, since they've all been amplified, politically weaponized, and placed under the shadow of the Holocaust, how will these be worked through, remembered, and transmitted? These tasks appear more overwhelming and intractable with every passing day. One lesson we have learned from the violence of the 20th and 21st centuries is that our future depends on a confrontation with painful and traumatic pasts, not as victims, but as world citizens in solidarity with others. Confronting the traumas we've inherited in this way is a first step toward enabling their transformation in the present and for the future. I believe that the post-memory of the Holocaust can be useful at this moment, but that is true only if those of us who have a stake in it refuse the inevitability of continued victimization, refuse to allow our histories to be used as an alibi for war and destruction. It can only be useful if the Holocaust's post-memory is viewed in relation to other violent and genocidal history, not as external to them and not as exceeding them. Each in its own specificity can gesture toward a possible future after such ruin. That said, the current and long-standing history of violence in Palestine will need its own structures of liberation and justice, community building and healing. I can only speak from one position. That is, I can speak for the responsibility of Jews who've lived with the legacy of the Shoah. Let us use that legacy in the interest of justice and solidarity with Palestinians whose lives are being destroyed. As the post-memory generations, we might begin by acknowledging how, inadvertently perhaps, we've ourselves perpetuated an image of Jewish victimization that has contributed to the present defensiveness that takes the form of aggression. Violent histories can be simplified in their aftermath. It's up to us to ensure that this moment will be remembered and transmitted as one not only of devastation, but also of activist solidarity and coexistence, leaving perhaps a little space for hope. Thank you.
Para comentar a conferência e mediar o debate, eu convido o professor Márcio Seligman Silva, que é doutor pela Universidade Livre de Berlim, pós-doutor pela Universidade de Yale, professor titular de Teoria Literária na Unicamp, pesquisador do CNPq e curador de exposições. É autor, entre outras obras, de Ler o Livro do Mundo, vencedor do Prêmio Mário de Andrade de Ensaio Literário da Biblioteca Nacional, O Local da Diferença, vencedor do Prêmio Jabuti na categoria Melhor Livro de Teoria Crítica Literária, A Virada Testemunhal e Decolonial do Saber Histórico, Passagem para o Outro como Tarefa, Walter Benjamin e a Guerra das Imagens. Foi professor visitante em universidades do Brasil, na Argentina, Alemanha, Inglaterra e México. Foi curador, entre outras, das exposições Memória Antônia, por uma memória ativa a serviço dos direitos humanos, no Centro Universitário Maria Antônia, e Marcelo Brodsky, Exílios, Escombros, Resistências, no Museu Judaico de São Paulo. Obrigada, Márcio.
Estão ouvindo? Muito obrigado, Esther. Obrigado a todos que estão envolvidos nesse importante evento. Para mim, um prazer, uma enorme honra estar ao lado da Marianne Hirsch, uma pesquisadora que acompanho há muitos anos, com muita curiosidade e com quem aprendo muito, mas não tinha tido o prazer ainda de conhecer pessoalmente. E, bom, difícil fazer comentários assim imediatos sobre uma palestra tão rica e tão complexa, mas eu acho que ela, pelo menos, evidentemente estou falando do meu ponto de vista, talvez seja importante falar, já que você e a Esther falaram, né? Eu também sou filho de uma sobrevivente, porque minha mãe nasceu em 1936, não em Berlim, porque meus avós que moravam em Berlim não conseguiam uma maternidade em Berlim para ela nascer, eles foram para Londres, onde minha mãe nasceu, e eles retornaram para Berlim, porque o meu avô achava que aquele palhaço que estava no poder não ia ficar muito tempo. Só que ele ficou tempo suficiente para matar milhões de pessoas. Então, nunca subestimemos os palhaços, né, na política. Enfim, mas não por acaso, né, eu acho que tem muito a ver com a fala da Marianne aqui hoje, né, a gente tem questões pessoais misturadas com questões acadêmicas, né, porque foi é o que aconteceu também no final do século passado e nesse século, né, onde a gente abandona concepções positivistas, né, que acreditam numa ideia de um pensamento descolado das pessoas, dos corpos, da história, né? O nosso pensamento ele é localizado, né? E eu, inclusive, espero que a tradução esteja seguindo a minha fala, um tanto desconectada, mais devagar. Ah, não, ela está seguindo? Não, tudo bem. Ok, you are following, ok. Tá bom. Então, eu acho que essa fala da Marianne, ela faz um plaidoyer no sentido de uma reavaliação de uma longa história, já, né, de várias décadas, né, do pensamento em torno da memória, em torno do trauma, né, da Shoah, dessa cultura da memória e das imagens que se desenvolveram em torno da Shoah, no sentido da solidariedade, né, no sentido de uma ruptura dessa cripta, para utilizar um conceito também psicanalítico, né, da Maria Torok e do Nicholas Abraham, que falavam do trauma como uma cripta. Então, de certa maneira, a Shoah foi recordada de uma maneira bastante encriptada, dentro desse casulo, descolado da história da longue durée, para falar com o Fernand Braudel, né, de uma história mais universal, né? Apesar de que, desde o início, pensadores como Simone Weil, Hannah Arendt, e logo depois também, né, da Segunda Guerra Mundial, né, Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon e muitos outros, sempre procuraram pensar a Shoah nesse contexto da longue durée e nesse contexto mais internacional e não da cripta, né, não de uma memória enquistada e extremamente pessoal e familiar, alguma coisa do gênero, né, que levou a esse modelo também de se pensar uma história que poderia justificar ações violentas, ações genocidas como as que estão sendo levadas a cabo hoje em dia, né. Eu não sei se eu superinterpreto, mas o que eu vejo na fala da Marianne é uma ideia de colocar os estudos da memória e do Holocausto para além do trauma. Para além do trauma. Não que o trauma vai ser abandonado, mas agora acho que a gente está no momento de pensar para além dessa traumatização em série, né? Isso que ela falou, né? Quer dizer, nós não somos sobreviventes, né, de segunda geração. Nós somos de novas gerações que descendem de pessoas que sobreviveram. Então, essa questão, esse remodelar o conceito de pós-memória, que ela tinha proposto já há algum tempo, né, implica pensar uma pós-memória traumática, talvez. Né? Nós vamos viver agora, para além dessa repetição, de certa maneira, traumática. Né? E ela citou bastante exemplos bastante interessantes aqui. Essa fotografia que ela mostrou naquela lista de campos de tortura e extermínio argentinos é do Marcelo Brodsky, né? Que teve uma exposição aqui recentemente, né, no Museu Judaico, como foi mencionado pelo Esther, que eu fiz a curadoria, e essa fotografia estava lá, ao lado da fotografia dessa mesma placa que tem na Wittenbergplatz, em Berlim, com a lista dos campos de concentração e extermínio nazistas. Então, o Marcelo é um dos artistas que circula o mundo inteiro estabelecendo dispositivos mnemônicos críticos e produzindo esse tipo de relação, né, entre essas violências, porque elas não são isoladas. Elas fazem parte de uma história, que é uma história também globalizada, né, que é uma história que tem também uma longue durée, como eu falei. Né? A Hannah Arendt ela insistia na relação entre o Holocausto e o imperialismo. O Holocausto é a violência colonial. Ela dizia que os generais nazistas, de certa maneira, foram treinados, né, ali na África colonial. Né? Então, estabelecer esses vínculos, né, estabelecer essas relações é fundamental para retirar o Holocausto desse local de singularidade absoluta. E que, inclusive, leva a questões bastante graves. Né? O Marcelo Brodsky, para voltar a ele tem uma série que se chama Traces of Violence, onde ele recupera imagens do genocídio, né, que o Império Alemão fez no atual território da Namíbia no começo do século passado. E ele convidou para escrever no catálogo os descendentes sobreviventes dessa barbárie que aconteceu na Namíbia no começo do século passado. E uma dessas pessoas fala: é impressionante que na Alemanha tenhamos centenas de memoriais para o Holocausto e não temos um memorial para lembrar a barbárie colonial da Alemanha. Então, quer dizer, no fundo, tem uma questão ali quase de uma Deckerinnerung, que é um conceito psicanalítico de uma memória encobridora. Né? Então, a Alemanha se sente moralmente satisfeita com essa memorialização do Holocausto. Em compensação, não produz outras memorializações, reconhecimentos e trabalhos de justiça também, de justiça de transição, com relação a outros crimes. Então, quando a Marianne, bom, em primeiro lugar, reconhece a questão óbvia, né, que nós temos que partir para pensar tudo isso dessa violência terrível que está acontecendo em Gaza, na Cisjordânia, e que está se expandindo agora. Né? E como responder, nós, como pensadores da memória, historiadores da memória, das imagens, da memória cultural, né, a gente não pode ficar inocente diante do que está acontecendo. A história exige, né, que repensemos isso. Né? Então, quando ela fala na transmissão do trauma vai além da família, é interessante, eu não sei se já existe, eu desconheço, né, um estudo, por exemplo, da memória da Shoah no Brasil e nos Estados Unidos. É interessante, porque a gente sabe que dos Estados Unidos nós temos dezenas de museus do Holocausto. No Brasil nós temos poucos, não sei 2 ou 3, né, memoriais com relação ao Holocausto. Né? Porque, de alguma maneira, e temos muitas famílias de sobreviventes aqui, mas, de alguma maneira, o ambiente cultural brasileiro não propiciou essa cultura da memória da Shoah tão vigorosa como aconteceu nos Estados Unidos, a ponto de abrir, eu me lembro nos anos 90, quando foi aberto o Museu do Holocausto de Washington, foi um evento mundial, né, praticamente. Né? A gente nunca teve isso aqui no Brasil. A memória do Holocausto aqui ela é muito mais, enfim, afogada, digamos assim, em outras histórias, né, de catástrofes que nós temos, né, que são aí, que demandam também uma pauta de inscrição e que também estamos em dívida gigantesca com relação a essa pauta. Né? Enfim, como eu falei, a Mirta Mink, né, que ela cita, essa artista argentina de origem judaica, me lembrou muito os trabalhos da Leila Danziger, Marianne. Eu vou depois te enviar alguns catálogos da Leila. A Leila é uma artista carioca que também filha de de imigrantes judeus, e o trabalho dela com memória tem bastante relação com isso que você mostrou a partir do trabalho da Mirta. Eu fiquei também bastante curioso para conhecer mais a Mirta, né? E, bom, tem um outro conceito que você introduz, né? De não considerarmos estes sofrimentos, que não são os sofrimentos que eu estou falando agora, que acontecem dentro da cripta, como simplesmente sentimentos de outros, né? Então, a gente precisa desoutrificar, né, a questão do disothering. Disothering, né, é essa questão de reconhecer o outro como um humano que sofre, né, e não um outro que sofre, como se existissem outros tipos de dor, outros tipos, né, de genocídio e de padecimento, né. Então, é a questão justamente que, já caminhando, né, para a tua conclusão, né, de superar, né, esse centrismo na ferida da Shoah, né? Na psicanálise também existe o conceito de ferida narcísica, né? A gente sabe como esse é um conceito importante para o Freud e para a psicanálise, né? Mas é como se tivesse, de uma maneira bastante, enfim, com consequências bastante graves, se desenvolvido uma ideia de um narcisismo da ferida, né? E a gente precisa superar esse narcisismo da ferida, porque isso é uma coisa muito feia. Não devemos ter orgulho das nossas feridas, nós devemos elaborá-las. É isso que ela fala aqui. A questão é elaborar o trauma, e não cultuar o trauma, fazer uma cultura, né, que cultue essa ideia do traumatismo, das gerações que vão sendo sempre retraumatizadas, como se isso fosse uma coisa positiva. Isso não é. O positivo é o diálogo, o positivo é romper a cripta, romper essa ideia, né, por exemplo, a Shoah como o crime dos crimes. Não existe hierarquia entre os genocídios, né? Nesse sentido, acho importante um autor como Walter Benjamin, né, que colocava nas suas teses sobre filosofia da história uma concepção da história como história violenta, né? E a história é violenta para todos os que são subalternizados, para todos que são outrizados, né? Para todos que não têm direito à memória, que não têm direito às suas vozes, né, serem ouvidas, né? Então, o direito ao testemunho no sentido de uma passagem para uma cultura do cuidado, né, e não uma cultura da reprodução, simplesmente, do elemento traumático dessas memórias. Então, é evidente, ela falou muito desses fundamentais arquivos, né, vídeo testemunhos, né? Tem esse fundamental do Fort Knox Video Archive, então, onde eu também pesquisei, né, há mais de 20 anos atrás, né, quando conheci também na ocasião o Geoffrey Hartman, que é um dos fundadores, né. Esses arquivos, eles são muito importantes, mas, novamente, eles não devem servir como uma espécie de santuário do trauma. Eles devem servir como história, como apresentação daquilo que aconteceu, daquele horror, mas também dialogando com outros testemunhos. Tem os testemunhos de Ruanda, tem os testemunhos do Camboja, tem os testemunhos da Nakba, né? Eu acho que essa amplificação, né, é fundamental. E não fazer o que, né, é uma coisa, eu não sabia disso, que a Marianne contou agora, né, que a Fundação Shoah da University of South California começou a entrevistar os sobreviventes do 7 de outubro como se fossem sobreviventes de um segundo Holocausto, né? Isso é justamente você reproduzir esse modelo do trauma como uma espécie de um dispositivo, né, que justifica o horror, que é tudo que a gente tem que recusar e desconstruir. Então, enfim, resumidamente, Marianne, eu só posso agradecer realmente as suas palavras, a importância das suas palavras, nesse momento onde as pessoas têm essa tendência a traduzir tudo em uma polaridade, sim e não, né, preto e branco, etc. Não se trata disso. Eu acho que se trata de um pensamento complexo, como você trouxe aqui, né? Se trata de desconstruir, né, essas máquinas genocidas que nós, de alguma maneira, participamos dela quando nós produzimos, né, memórias encriptadas, memórias que não permitem a dialogicidade, né? E eu acho que foi a favor desse diálogo que a Marianne nos falou aqui hoje, e eu só posso agradecer isso. É isso. Temos uma pergunta. Pode fazer, por favor. Primeiro se apresenta, por favor, nome e instituição.
I'm Daniel Strom, a history professor from the University of São Paulo and fellow Chernovitzel. If I understood correctly, your argument is that the memory of victimhood prevailed over resistance and resilience. And I wonder if that's not doomed. If we look at historically, the Yiddish word for the Holocaust is Churban, which means which goes back to the destruction of the temple. And the memory of the destruction of the temple, in that also victimhood prevailed over resistance, the memory of the revolt, and resilience that supposedly brought about the establishment of the Academy in Yavne, which supposedly brought about the hegemonic rabbinic culture. So even within the hegemonic rabbinic culture, the memory of victimhood prevailed and is commemorated in almost every other aspect of Jewish life over the centuries. And we can also find parallels in the memory of the Nakba, of the same example. So I wonder whether it's not inhuman, I don't know what, that puts victimhood before resistance and resilience. Thank you.
Esther asked me to we will have 3 questions only because of time. So we will hear the 3 questions and then you can answer, okay? Yes, I don't know. We have the second there and then third here. Okay.
Eu vou fazer.
Por favor, fala o teu nome e instituição no começo, tá? Pode perguntar também em português que tem tradução. A Esther disse que é melhor em português. Wait, espera um pouco, ela precisa ouvir, não está funcionando, parece, o microfone.
Alô? Agora foi. Tá. Meu nome é Breno. Como eu defendi meu doutorado, eu não estou ligado mais a nenhuma instituição. Mas eu estava até uma semana atrás ligado à USP.
Então você é uspiano, meu caro?
Eu sou uspiano, mas já recebi um e-mail de desligamento. Mas... minha pergunta, na verdade, ela tem a ver especificamente com a instrumentalização desses traumas no que está acontecendo em Israel, em Gaza. Eu acho que é sobretudo aí, e talvez isso se liga ao Hezbollah também. Me parece. Eu não tenho tanto material para afirmar isso em relação ao Hezbollah. Porque me parece que o que acontece lá é uma sobreposição de instrumentalizações de traumas. E o Holocausto, ele opera como uma entre outras. Eu sei que o governo de Israel e o Netanyahu, ele produz, em cima do Holocausto, uma instrumentalização para fora, e para a diplomacia, e para a ONU. Mas para dentro, não me parece que seja esse o único discurso de trauma instrumentalizado. Eu acho, pelo que eu acompanho, e eu também sou descendente de pessoas que passaram pela Shoah, e também morei em Israel e tenho familiares lá, que são contra o governo Netanyahu, graças a Deus. Mas me parece que é uma instrumentalização grande dos traumas vividos pelos judeus do norte da África e dos países do Oriente Médio. E ela é uma instrumentalização que tem a ver com a sobreposição da experiência judaica sobre qualquer universalismo, que eram valores importantes para, vamos dizer assim, a tradição sionista de esquerda, que governou muitos anos Israel, e que se liga ao que eles concebem com marginalização da experiência deles em Israel, ligado aos traumas que eles viveram nos países árabes, E então os gestos do Netanyahu, do governo do Likud e da extrema-direita, do Ben-Gvir, sobretudo, vão muito nesse sentido, me parece. de que Israel, na verdade, não é um país que está ligado à história da Shoah, ele é um país que está ligado à história do judaísmo. E é essa história do judaísmo que tem que ser reivindicada. E por isso que a grande Israel é tão reivindicada, de um projeto de restituição messiânico. Então, enfim, que os países árabes, então, e a experiência com os países árabes do norte da África, que produziu, no final das contas, que a gente pode chamar, para alguns deles, trazem essa narrativa de uma limpeza étnica, de 850 mil que tiveram que fugir, seja pela história do nacionalismo árabe, do panarabismo, seja por conta da criação do Estado de Israel. E isso, me parece, que também é sentido na França, em relação a um momento onde na França você tem uma grande imigração de judeus que vieram do Marrocos, Argélia e Tunísia, que revivem também essa disputa na França em relação à experiência, por exemplo, com o partido de extrema-direita francês, né, da tradição Le Pen, onde uma parte da experiência judaica vão falar, bom, mas isso é um medo da Le Pen que tem a ver com a experiência da Shoah, com o medo de judeus que viveram a Shoah em relação a isso. Mas nós que viemos do norte da África, nós não temos essa relação tão interna com... Desculpa, me desculpa. Então...
Nós temos mais uma pergunta. A professora aqui, ela também está demandando o direito de uma quarta pergunta. Então, vamos fazer a quarta pergunta e aí acabou, realmente. Por favor.
Meu nome é Mauro Weisber, eu sou aposentado da Universidade Federal de São Paulo, onde ainda atuo como voluntário, como orientador de pós-graduação. Eu começaria citando Edgar Morin, já deve conhecer, que discute a questão da complexidade. Eu acho que aqui houve um reducionismo muito grande. Por quê? Colocar o sofrimento de judeus só na Shoah, eu acho que é simplificar, parece que tudo correu bem. Nós temos uma história de 3.500 anos, isso aí é registro histórico, o resto já é mito. Nesses 3.500 anos, desses 3.500 anos, 2.000 anos são de perseguições. Então, tem todas as expulsões que eles sofreram, tem os massacres na Idade Média, tem Inquisição já na Idade Moderna. A Shoah é simplesmente a cereja do bolo, é o ápice disso aí. A senhora falou muito bem de epigenética. Eu trabalho na área de biológicas. Mas eu acho que, além da questão da epigenética, a senhora citou as mães da Praça de Maio. Tá? Tem um autor argentino, Blecher, é um psicanalista, e ele fala sobre a questão da narrativa. Então, vamos falar antes da narrativa, da memória. Tá? A memória é uma questão muito importante dentro do judaísmo. Eu não sei qual é o seu envolvimento com o judaísmo, mas a memória é uma questão muito importante, tanto que existe, é uma coisa que é repetida, eu vou falar em hebraico, traduzir, ledor, vador, de geração em geração. Agora, falar em genocídio, eu falaria sobre o genocídio dos povos originários da América, pelos portugueses e espanhóis. Eu falaria de genocídio do que os alemães fizeram na Namíbia, na Europa, isso são genocídios. Agora, quando a senhora tem uma instituição, um Estado que prega a destruição de outro Estado, tá? O Irã, claramente, é quem prega a destruição de Israel. Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, tudo mais, simplesmente são braços armados pelo Irã, certo? Armados e financiados pelo Irã. Tá? Então, eu acho que falar de pós-memória é um pouquinho precoce. Na verdade, nós estamos vivendo a questão da memória. Tá? Eu também não sou, sou brasileiro, mas a minha família, da parte do meu pai, só sobrou o meu avô. Da parte da minha mãe, teve alguns a mais que escaparam. Então, para uma história de 3.500 anos, esquecer 80 anos, desculpa, eu acho que é um pouquinho complicado. Tá? E lembrar bem, a senhora abordou só a Shoah. Agora, todo o resto, tá? A Inquisição, atualmente no Brasil calcula-se que 30% da população são de descendentes de indivíduos que fugiram de Portugal e Espanha e vieram para o Brasil, principalmente Portugal. Até 1750, quando começou a Corrida do Ouro, basicamente o que tinha no Brasil eram judeus, cripto-judeus e cristãos novos, que quem ia atravessar o mar para vir aqui basicamente estava fugindo. Então, a senhora está simplificando uma história muito complexa. Então, com todo respeito, eu agradeço a sua palestra, achei que a senhora realmente deu uma excelente palestra, mas, com todo respeito, tenho que discordar de grande parte do que a senhora falou e do que o do professor Seligman falou, que chamou genocídio. Genocídio não está acontecendo. Em Gaza, morreram 40 mil. 20 mil são combatentes do Hamas, só que eles morrem com roupa de civil. 20 mil morreram... 20 mil são combatentes do Hamas.
Eu acho só que tem uma questão de tempo, professor. Vamos passar
então
para a
eu
última
agradeço.
Pergunta. Obrigado. Ela tem já. We have a last question.
Bom dia a todos. Eu sou Shirley Schreier, professora sênior do Departamento de Bioquímica do Instituto de Química da USP. Inclusive, eu fiquei um pouco inibida sobre se perguntavam, não porque venho de uma área muito diferente e realmente não acompanho a coisa tão cientificamente quanto vocês. Mas bom, a primeira coisa, eu acho que eu tenho que me identificar também. O meu pai veio já casado para o Brasil em 36, a minha mãe só chegou em maio de 39. Como eu digo, eu escapei no último minuto, que é sempre assim com a minha vida. Mas, então, meu pai também amava muito o Brasil, mas quando a Esther falou sobre a história da vida dela, eu senti um pouco que não havia tanta coincidência entre a descrição, apesar da descrição que ela fez, da minha. Então, não querendo atrasar muito, eu queria dizer também que eu senti um pouco como o colega, realmente é um assunto muito complexo, né, que fica difícil abordar de uma forma, ainda mais numa conferência. Mas eu penso que acaba roubando um pouco também da objetividade. Eu concordo também com o que o Breno falou. Eu penso que eu, durante muitas décadas da minha vida, não fui muito conectada ao judaísmo. Eu mudei. Mas, então, o que eu quero dizer assim é que talvez não há uma maneira de você vai sempre ter muitas posições em relação a isso. Não há uma maneira de unificar. E eu acho que, sendo judeu, a gente realmente tem uma forma diferente de reagir. E aí, nisso, eu só queria mencionar isso. Eu senti falta de haver um detalhe. Eu concordo que... Bom, eu sou humanista, meu pai também era, e eu não quero fugir a reconhecer todos os outros genocídios e tragédias que o ser humano, que aí eu também tenho minhas definições para o ser humano, mas não são boas, né? Mas que o ser humano pratica. Eu penso que quando alguém me fala em Holocausto, eu lembro de lá de dentro, lá de passado aquele portão de Auschwitz. O que era? Era, como ele falou, um plano de extinção de milhões por nenhum motivo real, né? Nós vamos terminar. E o jeito que a gente vai fazer é botar esse pessoal num trem e levar lá para dentro, e lá eles vão para a câmara de gás e vão ser incinerados. Então, eu não consigo deixar de pensar isso. Muito obrigada.
Eu queria agradecer a presença de todos e a diversidade de perspectivas que emergiram aqui, e a FAPESP por promover esse debate e permitir que a gente converse sobre as diferenças, deixando claro que eu tenho muito orgulho da minha ascendência judaica, e só para responder para a professora, e que eu acho que a diversidade de opiniões faz parte desse legado do qual eu me orgulho de fazer parte, e que a gente está começando uma discussão no calor da hora, marcando uma intervenção que mostra que é possível conversar e é possível trabalhar em questões complexas fora de registros bipolares, né, bipolarizados, que têm marcado o debate contemporâneo, não só sobre essa questão, mas sobre muitas outras, e que a gente imagina, eu que também, enfim, estou ligada, trabalho com história das imagens, né? Tem também a ver com as formas pelas quais as imagens estão sendo processadas, da mesma maneira como no começo do século XX, as atrocidades que aconteceram também foram relacionadas com a emergência, né, de novas tecnologias, e isso alimentou o pensamento ocidental durante o século XX, essas relações, né? Mas, enfim, eu não vou me alongar aqui, eu queria só agradecer a presença de todos e esperar que... Yes, oh, okay, I'm sorry. Yes, yes, sure.
I know everybody's ready to go to lunch, but I want to thank you for your questions, and I'm taking them very seriously, and I'm taking the disagreements very seriously. And I just want to tell you a little bit about how I think about these questions. I'm not denying, thousands of years of persecution of Jews and the crypto-Jews that you have in South America, and very, very long-standing persecution, anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish. We all know that's true, absolutely true. We also know what happened with the, Jewish refugees from Arab lands in the aftermath of the creation of the State of Israel. That is very true, and the horrors of the Shoah, I'm the last person to deny that, because these were my childhood nightmares, as it seems they were childhood nightmares of many of us here. This is all absolutely true. We're at a different moment in history, and we have to, it seems to me, claim what it means now to have a Jewish state, what wants to be a Jewish state, not a democratic state for all its citizens, but a Jewish state that claims it is the space of safety and security for Jews in the world, but that's perpetrating war crimes at the very least, but in the opinion of many experts, and now being adjudicated in the International Criminal Court, genocide or genocidal actions that have made it impossible for people of Palestinians to live in that space, that have made that space unlivable. We have to understand what happens with that. That was not actually the subject of my lecture. The subject of my lecture is the instrumentalization of the Holocaust in the service of that. And I'm speaking to my colleagues in the field to say we haven't considered how we've ourselves allowed this space where this history is being instrumentalized. So I'm doing this in the interest, first of all, of continuing Holocaust studies, continuing to study this history. New archives are being opened, new objects are appearing. How do we do this now in view of this larger context. So I'm not washing my hands of this, and I'm not denying the Holocaust and the suffering, or the long-standing suffering of Jews through millennia. I'm not denying that. I'm trying to make a space of where we can continue to do this important historical and ethical and moral work responsibly by taking into account the power that this state has now done to impose and to its own power on others. Why do we remember victimization more than resilience? It's not actually true, because the State of Israel has chosen, as Holocaust Remembrance Day, the day of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, rather than January 25th, where the rest of the world celebrates or commemorates it, which is the liberation of Auschwitz. So Israel itself has chosen the day of fighting and of resistance as its day of commemoration. Now we're at a different moment, so victimization is more usable for current political purposes. So memory shifts, and the effects of memory are not only in the service of justice, they can be in the service of injustice, and that's really what I wanted to think about today. I believe that there are different ways of dealing with the risk and the tremendous danger to Israel that Israel is in today. I mean, I believe that it's tremendous danger. I believe primarily from the inside, but certainly also from the outside. There are different ways of dealing with this, and on October 18th, which is the day that my parents were married in 1941 in the ghetto of Chernovitz in what was then Romania, I wrote a letter to my family and my children and my friends saying, this is not my parents who were married under those circumstances, which made it possible for me to be here today, right? And to survive, that I do not want this war in their names, and they would not have wanted this war to be happening in their names. There are different things that I don't believe in the language of self-defense that's actually being, universally, almost universally accepted right now. I think that a state like Israel has not the right to self-defense, but an obligation to create a world that is safe, not only for Jews, but for everyone in that region and the world, and for Jews the world over. That's an obligation that any state has, but that does not mean that we bomb the hell out of our neighbors. It means something different. It means that we create a world in which we can cohabit. So let me end with that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the comment and answer. And now I speak in Portuguese again, because eu tenho que fazer uns anúncios. Eu queria anunciar as próximas palestras que vão ter aqui no dia 25 de outubro, Latim em Pó, o que nossa língua pode nos ensinar sobre democracia, poder, diferença e convívio, com Caetano Galindo. E no dia 29 de novembro, o futuro dos combustíveis para a mobilidade no Brasil, com Luiz Augusto Horta Nogueira. É isso, eu agradeço novamente a Marianne, ao público, aos organizadores. Ficamos por aqui hoje. Obrigado.